Precisely 2 hours after we last recorded, a major scandal broke in Israel. The former Patsarit, the military's top legal official, Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi, had authorized the leak of classified, manipulated video footage during wartime. In July 2024, Israeli soldiers were openly and forcefully detained, accused of having abused a Palestinian detainee at the state Teman detention facility. The arrests of the soldiers were conducted in such an unorthodox way that they provoked mass criticism toward the military prosecution and even riots. The video leak came soon after, and an ensuing investigation by the Military Advocate General's office itself claimed that there was no way of knowing the source and even lied to this effect in the Supreme Court. Now, the story was damaging. Accusations of systemic abuse toward Palestinian detainees ran rampant in the world, and for Israel's right specifically, the story fueled the notion of a politicized legal system pitted against the people. Over the past 2 weeks, the story of the leak has gotten much weirder and much bigger. A recent criminal inquiry revealed that the military legal advisor herself had leaked the tape with the knowledge of other officers, a conclusion launching the saga of soap opera-like proportions centered on the legal advisor, real or fake suicide attempts, and attempts to dispose of evidence. And the real story now are the explosive implications for Israeli civil and military rule of law. I'm Elena Maizel-Diamant, and this is Basic Law. Joining us today to discuss is Israeli legal scholar Yonatan Green, author of the newly published book on the Israeli justice system, Rogue Justice. Yonatan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So, look, this story has a lot of twists and turns. I've glossed over even some of the, I suppose, more outrageous details. Can you give us a quick walkthrough, starting in July 2024, of what has happened, how we've come to the point now where the Patsar is no longer an officer. She's been replaced. She's in custody. There's a major court battle now over who investigates this issue. Just walk us through what's happened, please.
Sure. So we'll run through the succession of events, I think, fairly quickly. The story kind of broke in July of 24 when there was a sudden arrest of numerous reservists on this base called Teman. Teman is sort of one of the main holding facilities for Hamas terrorists, especially the most dangerous ones, the Nukhba fighters, those who were caught on October 7th, captured on October 7th, or those who were sort of the most with the most known record of atrocities or terrorist activities. And this story broke when numerous of these reservists were arrested. They were arrested on the base. So, multiple sort of military law enforcement forces raiding essentially the base and taking these reservists into custody. And then this whole saga sort of started snowballing and spiraling. You had riots or other sort of civilians entering the this military base, trying to get to the bottom of things. You had a sort of major public backlash, an outcry against the way that these reservists were treated as common criminals due to sort of what seemed to be very superficial allegations by some of these Hamas operatives. The next stage in this was that a video was leaked. Some kind of purportedly incriminating video was leaked. This video seemed to show some of these reservists allegedly perpetrating some kind of abuse against inmates, against prisoners at this facility. This in turn also led to very significant questions about how the video was leaked, who was privy to this information. These were sort of security camera, classified videos.
And the video was purportedly, by the way, like today, I believe there were allegations of sexual abuse included with the physical abuse. The sexual abuse allegations have been debunked. The physical abuse is under investigation.
Correct.
We're talking about the rule of law issues here. The issue itself of potential abuse of this detainee is under investigation and should be under investigation.
Correct. And so far, we can actually get back to the specific investigation of these individuals who've been indicted in a moment. This video that came out obviously made significant waves both in Israel and internationally. But coming back just to the question of where the leak came from or who that was, there was some question of investigating within the military attorney general office who would leak the video or how it came that the video was leaked. The deputy military attorney general was tasked with investigating this leak. This itself had raised numerous eyebrows in terms of it seemed most plausible that the leak was coming from the military attorney general's office. So it was unclear why the deputy military attorney general, which we just call it MAG, the deputy MAG, MAG, was investigating this. Very importantly for our story, then, the Israeli legal counsel to the government, also sometimes known as the attorney general, the legal counsel to the government got behind or got very much involved with this whole process and supported the investigative effort, or especially supported the fact that it was handled by the military attorney general's office themselves. So this is an important part. And both the legal counsel to the government and the state prosecutor themselves sort of vouched for this investigation into the MAG office. And all this led to the conclusion or the summary that there was nothing to investigate, that there was no possibility to find any significant information about the leak or where it came from or who leaked, etc. That's sort of chapter one of this saga. And I'm putting aside for a moment the substantive allegations. We'll get back to that in a moment. I will say in the interim, it became absolutely clear, irrefutably clear, importantly, that this video was doctored, that it was an edited video. It spliced together a number of unrelated parts of video, and it created an impression of continuity between two different parts, which was completely false. And of course, as an aside, we can get back to this. The main charges, the most heinous charges regarding rape or sexual abuse, have been dropped. Essentially, they haven't even been indicted on these charges. Those have disappeared completely from the investigation for good reason. They seem to have been entirely baseless. So it's not just that this video was leaked illegally, but it was also doctored and edited in order to create a very, or it would seem in a way that created a very damaging image of these reservists. Now, the current saga, or what's happened just now, is that new information came to light, and this is we can get into how that information came to light because that's also kind of important. The new information came to light showing essentially irrefutably from essentially a confession from someone within the MAG office that the leak emanated from the head, the chief of MAG themselves, from the military attorney general, Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi. This is the most senior ranking legal officer in the military. The leak emanated from her and her office. She was fully aware of it. There were a number of co-conspirators, and I'm using the word conspiracy in the legal sense, not in the sort of crackpot sense, but in the actual legal sense. There were a number of co-conspirators who were in on this, who were privy to the leak. These co-conspirators, including Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi, then deceived the Supreme Court, deceived deceived the public, deceived the media in the ensuing investigation of this leak. And then finally, the last part I could put on this is that another important section or another important element is the involvement or the unknown degree of involvement of the legal counsel to the government and the state prosecutor. To what extent were they aware that this leak did emanate from the MAG office? To what extent were they aware that the MAG was actually actively lying to them? In the best case scenario, they were grossly negligent because they had vouched for this investigation. They had vouched for the fact that they were personally supervising the investigation within the MAG office. So again, in the worst case, they were in on it and co-conspirators. In the best case, they were grossly negligent in their supervision of this issue. So this is sort of the most recent chapter of the saga. And then, of course, Elena, if you'd like me to, or you can fill in sort of the very last moments of what's been happening recently.
No, feel free. But because you basically have brought us to the court battle of this week, where in a sort of Solomonic fashion.
Correct. So this has obviously led to some very dramatic developments, and I'll putting aside for a moment that the moment this was published, there were all kinds of disputed accounts or different accounts, different announcements from the MAG office, from the MAG herself. She was not initially arrested, and her possessions, including her cell phone and her computers, etc., were not initially seized, and we can get back to why that is and how that compares to other incidents in Israel. After about 5 days of this being out and wide in the open, and as this clearly became something which was not just going to disappear and could not just simply be denied, it was clear that the evidence against the MAG was irrefutable. Then there was either an attempted suicide or a feigned attempted suicide in order to destroy evidence. The MAG lost her phone in the ocean, with again sort of
Lost her phone in the ocean is
well, I'll put it differently. The MAD was arrested without her phone after she had been in the ocean, and she had claimed that it had been lost in the ocean with obviously very severe suspicion that this was simply a deliberate attempt to get rid of the of key evidence. And I will say, I'm all for giving people the benefit of the doubt, and I think that people taking their own lives in the midst of these kind of investigations is not unheard of and is a terrible thing and something that we need all to be wary and cautious of. Um, this military attorney general, Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi, is a person that can receive no benefit of the doubt in this situation. Meaning, this is a person who has deceived the public, who has acted illegally, in complete knowledge of the implications and of the repercussions of their actions, and has then lied actively to the Supreme Court in sworn affidavits, in testimony, lied to prosecutors, lied to investigators, and to the public themselves. So this is not exactly a person that we can attribute great trust to. And then finally, the last part of this entire saga is that now becomes a question: who will investigate? Who has the authority to properly investigate and prosecute these issues? And part of the uh, fundamental problem here is that the legal counsel of the government or the state prosecutor are uh, in on this up to their necks. At the very least, in the best case scenario, these two officials will need to be questioned and they will need to be investigated. So this has now come to the Supreme Court, the question of who will lead the investigation on this matter.
So, exactly. And as of yesterday, this is what I was going to say about Solomonic fashion. The court has basically said that the Minister of Justice's candidate for this position, who is currently serving as what's the position? The ombudsman for.
For judicial misconduct or for complaints against the judiciary.
So there was a challenge against his selection of that person on the grounds that it was an illegal selection. And then, of course, the Attorney General's office wanted to investigate this, and you kind of run into the same issues of conflict of interest. And so the Ministry of Justice is not willing to let that happen. And the court yesterday, from what I was reading, I'm currently abroad, so I can't even get a feel for, what's happening in the Israeli public. But the court's position was just like, go compromise. It's not going to be this one. It's not going to be that one. It doesn't work. And so this is something that's really rocking the Israeli public now. We've actually skipped over some of the more sordid, like Turkish soap opera like details. In fact, whether the beach was a feigned suicide attempt or not. Later, I think it was found that Ms. Tomer-Yerushalmi had taken a bunch of sleeping pills and she's been hospitalized, and it's gotten quite crazy at the level of those kinds of details. But you and I have spoken about the fact that this is just a much, much bigger story, even in the most absorbing, kind of scintillating, gossip aspects of it, as horrible as they are. And that is because they shed tremendous light on serious issues in the civil and criminal justice systems. So I'd like to turn to that, and let's devote the rest of the show to talking about these important questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elena. Yeah, I think that this is an excellent opportunity to talk about some of the broader issues, not obviously in a comprehensive way, but some of the broader issues within the Israeli criminal justice system, within civilian oversight of law enforcement agencies and bodies. One thing that I'll note in my book, Rogue Justice: The Rise of Judicial Supremacy in Israel, available on Amazon. In my book, I dedicate a very significant chapter to the criminal justice system, which seems sort of out of place on a book about the judiciary. But part of the point, which we'll get to in a moment, which I'll explain in greater detail, is that there is a symbiotic and reciprocal relationship between the judiciary and the expansion of judicial power in Israel, and between law enforcement agencies, including the police, the prosecution service, and others, and the relatively high degree of impunity that they get for abuses of power, for illegal actions, etc. I think it's no coincidence that this issue has blown up over leaks, and leaks is kind of a good example. Israel has become accustomed to the reality in which law enforcement agencies and prosecution services across the board regularly leak evidence and investigative material, whether raw or paraphrased or whatever it is, to the media. And this is something which essentially the government and other bodies have been incapable of properly investigating and prosecuting and looking into. And this is something which we've just gotten used to. And I think that the way that Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi acted, meaning this really is extraordinary in the way that this has come to light in terms of the brazenness of her actions, the deliberate leak, the conspiracy of multiple parties, then the direct deception, the pure lies to the Supreme Court in affidavits, in sworn testimony to the public. Part of this, I think, should be seen as a symptom of the way that law enforcement bodies in Israel view themselves, the way they view their mission, and the way they view, again, their degree of impunity and their immunity from serious scrutiny from civilians. Now, I'll take a step back, if you don't mind, Elana, even further back for a moment. Yeah.
Before you go too far back, can you give I suspect that our audience is not necessarily on top of this history of leaks. So maybe could you just mention a couple of others that stick out in public memory?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, probably the most significant examples are from the recent years in the Netanyahu investigations, where just throughout the investigations, even before the indictment stage, information, including transcripts, including recorded conversation, were simply regularly leaked to the press, and it was the intention and the effect were clear. It was to bolster public support for their prosecution. It was to maybe have some kind of political or electoral outcomes. I can say that um, Avichai Mendelblit, who eventually became the attorney general, eventually became the legal counsel to the government, had complained of the leaks epidemic to the Supreme Court because during his confirmation process, during the process of his appointment as legal counsel of the government, various law enforcement agencies had begun leaking information about investigations and suspicions against him. And he had complained about this to the Supreme Court. And then, once he became legal counsel of the government, he reversed position entirely, and in various petitions to the court against this leaks phenomenon, Mandelblit essentially claimed that there was no way to investigate the leaks. There was no way to properly get to the bottom of where they come from or who has perpetrated them, etc.
Okay, now you're free. Now you're free to zoom out.
Well, I'll take. Obviously, we can't have an entire description of Israel's law enforcement criminal justice apparatus, but I do want to take half a step back and just say that unlike many jurisdictions and unlike many countries in the West, the Israeli law enforcement apparatus, with all its different parts, is fairly autonomous. And what I mean by that is that its heads and leaders are typically not directly appointed, and certainly at the sort of deputy level, are not directly appointed by the government of the day by elected officials. And at the same time, these bodies are not selected or elected by the public directly. So there's no direct elections, not for district attorneys, not for police chiefs, not for these more senior positions within these law enforcement apparatuses. And we see how even figures like the Minister of Justice or even the government itself, meaning the cabinet, right, the collective body of the government, has very limited ability in terms of both its ability to select who they put in these positions and the ability to fire people that they want to remove from these positions. We've seen this recently with the legal counsel to the government. We've seen this with the chief of police. We've seen this with the head of the domestic security service, with the Shin Bet, the Shabbat. So to begin with, we have this very unusual situation. Now, one of the phenomena, which is, I think, most important to understanding the judiciary's power in Israel, which I think is something which is not properly or not sufficiently understood, is the way in which the judiciary has weaponized law enforcement in order to either remove objectionable figures or intimidate politicians, or to further its interests in a variety of other ways. And there are literally dozens of examples of this issue. When he was member of Knesset, Reuven Rivlin, who eventually became the president of the state, he coined the phrase, the rule of law hoodlums, the rule of law thugs. He was set to become Minister of Justice. He was considered sort of antagonistic or hostile to the judiciary, to judicial power. And that appointment was blocked because of a series of police investigations, which quickly turned out to be completely bogus, and they were dropped as well. But his appointment was blocked just for this reason. And
No, I should mention that I think reflexively for people who are might be critical of your position or who might feel like you're overstating things, they could easily say that there's a high level of political corruption that just needs to be investigated, right? So how would you respond? Like, how would you set the stage for responding to that and to just sort of try and ensure that the answer doesn't get bogged down by seeming, partisan affiliations?
Correct. Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying that many of these or I should say, the weaponization of the criminal justice system has been directed at the left, almost as much as it's been directed at the right, and I should say the political left have suffered from this to a great extent. Also, in historically speaking, whether it's the Rabin government, whether it's other prominent figures. Professor Yoav Dotan from the Hebrew University is one of Israel's top administrative law experts, says, look, every single prime minister in Israel since the 1990s has been either criminally investigated or indicted for crimes and for corruption, essentially. Either Israel is uniquely skilled at electing criminal politicians, or there's something else going on here. Now, in every objective measure, meaning there are sort of well-known objective measures and criteria for these issues, Israel is not a profoundly corrupt country, and the public service in Israel is not one. It's not a bakshish culture. It's not a culture in which you can simply walk up to a person, or which there are all these sort of backdoor dealings or underhanded, sort of under the table dealings. So I think, to begin with, the idea that Israel is so endemically corrupt that it requires or that it justifies this sort of heavy-handed law enforcement just doesn't hold up. More importantly, a significant amount of criminal investigations and even criminal indictments against figures who've been considered hostile to the judiciary, hostile to judicial power, a great many of these have turned out to be bogus, unfounded. They were either dropped after they had served their purpose, or the courts themselves have thrown them out. And I'm talking about sort of trial court level courts have thrown them out or acquitted these different figures. So there is no question, and some of Israel's top legal experts have pointed this out and say so explicitly. There's no question that there is a pattern in Israeli law enforcement of targeting, or of maybe, if you want to give it sort of a more innocent angle of, of putting extra emphasis on figures who are considered to be hostile or less sympathetic towards the judiciary and the expansion of judicial power in Israel.
Okay, so before I so rudely interrupted and wanted to get a little more context here, you were saying basically that you've got these issues of leaks and you've got issues of other unaccountable action, in part because the heads of these relevant offices, or whether it's in the police or whether it's the attorney general, they're not, in your view, it's problematic that they're not directly appointed or accountable to the political rung, because they go through these sort of convoluted civil service appointment processes that are controlled by the bureaucracy itself.
And ultimately correct, and ultimately controlled by judicial review, meaning, even if someone passes muster through the different bureaucratic hoops that they have to jump through, or whatever it is, then you might have the court itself weighing in about whether they think this is an appropriate person to lead. Just an example, in 2011, three of the most important figures in Israeli military and law enforcement were essentially blocked from being appointed to their positions. General Gal Hirsch, was blocked from becoming chief of police by the court, essentially. Yoav Gallant was blocked from becoming chief of general staff for the IDF. Essentially, again, this is it's a little bit more complicated than that, but this is broadly how it worked. And of course, this is described in great detail in my book. Again, there's a lot of ground to cover. We won't get into everything. All this is just to say that there is a marked difference in the level of accountability between law enforcement agencies in Israel and the way they function versus what you might be familiar, what the audience might be familiar with in most countries. I talked about this top down, in terms of the political forces and their ability to hire, to fire, to have significant oversight. The Knesset committees in the parliament have very limited ability to subpoena witnesses, to penalize witnesses who are called to give testimony, who are not giving straight answers, who simply don't show up. I mean, this is a notorious issue in Israel, that civil servants simply don't show up to hearings inside parliament. There's nothing parliamentarians can do about it. And then from a bottom-up perspective, like I said, it's not just a question of elections, or whether, it's not even like the mayor or other local elected officials are appointing many of these figures or many of these roles. But also, just to give you another example, Israel has no jury system. And I believe, as far as I know, that it's the only common law country, the only democratic developed common law country, meaning that it inherited its legal system from the English common law system. It's the only one which doesn't have any jury system whatsoever. And this is, again, without getting too much into it, this is just an example. It's just a symptom of this reality in which the criminal law enforcement agencies are a power unto themselves. They act with a very high degree of autonomy and independence, with very little inputs from the political class, from elected officials, and from the electorate themselves. Now, this is where we can actually, I think, connect this to judicial supremacy, Elena.
Well, you're welcome to do that. But I do have just one, I think, side comment about this issue of insulation that you're raising from accountability. I see also potentially, without any inside knowledge, I should carry out, but I see also a certain kind of insularity in the approach to this issue. Because if what Tomer-Yerushalmi said was true about why she authorized this leak, right, which was effectively to protect the reputation of the prosecution. God knows why you would choose to do it this way. But then, there's a certain kind of either ignorance about the effects that releasing such a video could have, put aside the criminality, but just the sheer effects. Israel's being accused of genocide and abuse of Palestinians on a world stage. Obviously, incidents happen in wartime. I don't think it's fair to say that they don't, but it happens everywhere, and we have, as far as we know, a fairly low incidence. Okay, and it's something that truly harms the entire state. It harms the IDF, and it's such a sort of narrow. I mean, I have a lot of words for it. I'm trying to restrain myself, but it's narrow, and it's almost insane to think that releasing that kind of thing could in any way protect any element of the IDF, let alone any element of the state of Israel. And it seems, I think, to show both a responsiveness to whatever internal world within the bureaucracy she felt responsible to, and also potentially to the other legal authorities in her milieu, which is to say international, the people populating the sort of the world of international law and global governance. So it was sort of maybe a gesture toward them. And I think, again, it speaks to the issue of insularity, but it's like there's a worldview issue here as well that results from the kind of structural things that you're talking about. Now, you'd like to talk about judicial supremacy in our final minutes, and who am I to stop you?
Actually, I think you raised a very good point. So I'll even forego talking about judicial supremacy just to address what you said. I know. Well, I've written a whole book about it, so I hope that our audience will be interested enough in judicial supremacy. But I'll say a last sentence when I'm after this part about judicial supremacy. I'll keep it very short. What I do want to respond to what you said. First of all, I'll put aside for a moment that on its face, the claim that Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi, that the MAG leaked this video in order to, as a PR effort, essentially, in order to protect the reputation of the prosecution, or in order to clarify to the public how severe these actions are, or how compelling the evidence is against these reservists, or whatever, is profoundly both implausible and insincere. Giving Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi's explanations any credence is already dignifying her response more, I think, than it deserves. This is a person who has been a serial liar to the Supreme Court, a person who has acted in criminally poor faith, who has flouted the law in the most brazen way. So this is a person who, frankly, whatever they say is their public excuse or explanation. That needs to be seen more in the context of getting her story straight. And frankly, it's an obstruction of justice. It's just a way for her to signal to all the people around her and to all the co-conspirators what the excuse is going to be going forward. That's essentially how this is, I think, perceived in professional legal circles. It's also just implausible in the sense that if she really believed that, meaning if you were a prosecutor that seriously believed that this was the case and that you had to release some investigative information, some evidence in order to protect the reputation of the prosecution or in order to set the record straight or whatever, then you ask the court. Then you can petition the court, or you can. There are numerous ways in which you can formally and officially authorize the release of this kind of evidence. This isn't the first time ever that a prosecution service has released evidence to the public in order to protect their name or in order to somehow, quell riots or whatever it is. I think that's also implausible in and of itself. I think there's another layer here, which you correctly mentioned, which I think is this complicates things, and I won't get into it. But there is a layer here of how the military legal organizations and the military legal bodies view themselves and where they are oriented on this sort of left-right continuum, this progressive conservative continuum, this national security sort of continuum, in terms of their core perspective towards the IDF, towards reservists, towards the Israeli military and their actions. And there is some suspicion, and I won't get into this because I think this is more sort of partisan, this is more sort of speculative, but there has been a long-standing allegation against the military legal corps that it has been much more on the side of sort of the more, as you mentioned, sort of the more international view, the view which is much more suspicious of the IDF, of human rights violations, much more sympathetic to whether it's allegations of abuses by Palestinians or by Gazans or by Hamas or whatever it is. And again, I won't get into this, but this certainly ties into that problem or this potential for you have a military corps which essentially seems highly willing to accept the legal arguments and even the sort of factual arguments made by the other side, much less willing to give the benefit of the doubt to our own soldiers, to our own military. Again, this is a whole other issue, but I think worth mentioning. The last thing that I'll say, which I think most ties into what you're saying, is that I think there is a broader issue here in terms of the mindset. This almost sort of meaning if we give Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi the benefit of the doubt that she actually means what she's saying, and even if we don't, there certainly is something here in the mindset of the legal elite in Israel, which sees itself in some ways as embattled, right? They see themselves as they are the last line of defense against both the infiltration of Kahanist, messianic, extreme radical right-wing elements into all parts of Israeli government and especially law enforcement and military. And two, they see themselves as the bulwark, the final line of defense against deterioration of Israeli democracy and the destruction of rule of law. And this is the effect, and I think those are both, plainly and blatantly untrue and unfounded conceptions or views of what's happening in Israeli society. But what we've seen with, I think, the MAG, the brazenness of this and their willingness to flout the law, and even in their own sort of rationalization of why they were able and permitted to do that, this is all part of an environment of hysteria, of alarmism, of hyperbole, which has really taken over large parts of the Israeli legal establishment. And this is one of the results of that. In the US, right, if you say enough times that somebody's a fascist and somebody's a Nazi and somebody is trying to destroy American democracy, then some crazy person is going to pick up a gun and do something about it. And this is one of the terrible things that we've seen. So in Israel, if you are constantly telling all the lawyers and the entire legal establishment that Israeli democracy is deteriorating and you are the last line of defense, then you are implicitly giving them license to act unlawfully and to lie to the court and to do all these things which are blatantly illegal. If you'll allow me, I will say one more sentence about the connection to judicial supremacy.
I will, of course, allow you. I would like to end, though, on a somewhat more, I wouldn't say uplifting in light of everything we've been talking about.
Conciliatory.
I'd say conciliatory because I think really, really, really the only way forward for Israel at this point is to have a much richer, more equal discussion between battling sides. And, you clearly have views on where the responsibility sits. I have views that I try not to be quite as vocal about about the responsibility sits. But ultimately, the solution here is going to be through political compromise between people that simply don't agree on a lot of foundational questions. And this episode, I hope, is an opening for additional talk about that. And you've also seen actually in the Knesset, even members of the opposition seeming to sort of take this as the moment to talk about reform based on a broad consensus of issues that have, clearly cropped up. And this is something, this particular story, although it certainly harks back to complaints that conservatives have had about the legal system. And I'm talking about legal conservatives, so that includes people on the left and the right. But this particular story is so stunning, it's so staggering, it's so big that it crosses that chasm that had opened up for, many years prior. Now that's my general take on it. I'll let you have the final word, Mr. Yonatan Green.
Well, I will now truly forego the opportunity to talk more about judicial supremacy, and our audience can read more about it on my book. I will also end by agreeing with you, in the sense that I'm not sure that this is quite, as you said, I'm not sure this is quite optimistic, or the right way to call it. I think that the severity of the actions taken by the MAG and the degree of, or the type of evidence which is arrayed against her has exposed this problem to such a stunning and dizzying extent that it has backed many elements, whether it's the judicial supremacists or the rule of law hoodlums, the rule of law thugs, as Reuben Rivlin called them. It has backed this camp into a corner in a way that even the Supreme Court, or even many of the powers that be, cannot let it slide. They cannot simply ignore. They cannot sweep it under the carpets. So in this sense, I'm optimistic that this might galvanize both the public and the systems to consider not just this issue, which is less important. Whatever happens to the MAG, whatever happens with Teman, that's not important. What's important is a more general understanding of how can we properly investigate abuses by law enforcement agencies. How can we properly set up mechanisms which are capable, like a special prosecutor system that you have in the U.S. and elsewhere. How can we set up mechanisms which are more capable both of preventing these issues and of properly investigating them? And I am somewhat optimistic, I don't know if hopeful, that this has the potential to lead to some of those changes.
Yonatan Green, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, Rogue Justice is out now. And for people that want to really get an inside, in-depth view of the way in which we've come to the point where we are, this is a book for you.
Thank you so much, Elena.